All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, students. I don't know what time you're going to be watching this, but this will be the remote learning video over inflation rate and consumer price index, or CPI. So this is just part 2 of our Unit 2 content for this class. Unit 2 is measures of macroeconomic performance. We're talking about the big numbers that indicate how well an economy is doing. Last week we talked about GDP, and that's the previous set of videos, the GDP notes part 1 and part 2, so make sure you have those. And in those notes, we both cover GDP as a concept and some of the positives, that it shows us nation's overall productivity, and negatives, which is that it doesn't really show us how well each individual person is doing. It just shows us the average, right? As well as a bunch of math. And today will be a similar kind of setup. I won't be doing 2 separate videos for this, so this video will probably run longer than those GDP videos did. But this would cover in my class 2 days of content. This could take reasonably about an hour 15 to get through. But it's the full setup of what inflation is, how do we find inflation rate, why is that important, what do we use it for, blah, 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 blah. As well as CPI, which is the more complicated part because it's something that people are not as familiar with. The Consumer Price Index, how that works, how that number is figured out, what the hell that number means, and then what do we use that for, both in the class and in the real world. So we'll be covering those 2 concepts. I'll be showing you some math practice at the end of how to find CPI in problems. Inflation rates generally a little bit easier, but CPI I'll show you how to work through that, and that'll be it for this lesson. So, with all that being said, let's pull up the PowerPoint, the lesson. Sorry, I just like to format my lessons on PowerPoint. It makes my life a lot easier. Okay, there we go. So, inflation and the Consumer Price Index. My class, September 23rd and 24th, when we're covering this, whenever you decide to watch this video, is whenever. But, let's start talking about it. So I mentioned in the GDP video that inflation is a massive problem. One is just that in definition itself, which is an overall increase in price level and the fall in the purchasing value of your money. Basically, everything gets more expensive. If there's inflation happening, everything is getting more expensive. The inflation rate is the rate at which prices are going up. So if the price was $10 last year and $12 the next year, the inflation rate there would have been 20% because prices went up by 20%. And that's significant. 10 to 20 doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but 100 to 120, 1,000 to 1,200, 10,000 to 12,000, we're talking a significant chunk of change here. So you want to be very careful when we're talking about, inflation rate, it's only like 2 or 3%. That doesn't mean a lot. It doesn't mean a lot in small transactions like the price of a pack of gum. It means a lot when we're talking about large-scale transactions, the price of a home, the price of a car, or a thing that you guys are probably very intimately familiar with, the price of college tuition, in which inflation rate there being significantly high matters quite a bit. It does happen naturally over time. This is due to supply and demand. Or we mentioned in supply and demand, when the demand for stuff goes up, prices will rise, right? People want a thing more than, or if more people want a thing, then the price of that thing will go up. Well, cool. What happens to population naturally over time? It goes up, right? Well, if population's naturally going up over time, then wouldn't also prices naturally go up over time? There's this constant sort of tug on prices, pulling them upwards due to rising demand. That's sort of a natural type of inflation. So we sort of acquiesce to that, and as a nation, as a government, our goal isn't to have zero inflation. Because we want our country to be growing population-wise too, because that would mean infant mortality is relatively low, people want to live here, people want to move here, we aren't in wars and conflicts and stuff like that. But population going up would be good. Now, too much population could be bad, but right now for America, we don't have an unsustainable population. The tricky part for inflation, how is it bad, is when we don't know it's going to happen. That gets us down to the idea of anticipated inflation versus unanticipated inflation. If we anticipate it, if we predict it, if we say, hey, we predict that prices are going to go up by 3% next year, and they go up by 3%, we'll be fine. Why? Businesses can pay their workers 3% more, they can raise wages by 3%, they can do what's called a cost of living adjustment, which is a very standard thing at a lot of salaried jobs, which part-time workers don't get this, but full-time workers, myself included, tend to get cost of living adjustments every single year. That's a pay raise that is offered by businesses to sort of try and make up for the fact that inflation happens. So if we expect it and we predict it properly and we pay people properly, then inflation won't really hit us very hard, right? 3% pay raise, 3% prices go up. Cool. That's not going to feel any more expensive to me then. I will, in practicality, be as functionally rich as or poor as I was before. I'm getting a 3% pay raise, but if everything's 3% more expensive, then those kind of cancel, right? Now, unanticipated inflation is where the tricky part is, because say we predict that there's going to be 3% inflation and we give all of our workers a 3% pay raise. But let's say that instead inflation actually happens to be 4%, that there was some unanticipated element, something we couldn't see coming, cough, cough, COVID, cough, cough, that could cause prices to go up. Now, COVID might cause some prices to go up, some to go down, but I'm saying an event that we don't necessarily predict that makes prices for things go up. If that happens, then guess what? I'm getting paid 3% more, but everything is 4% more expensive. I'm functionally 1% poorer now. I got a 3% pay raise, but everything is 4% more expensive. That means, functionally speaking, everything's going to feel 1% more expensive to me. That doesn't sound like a lot, but again, when we're talking about homes and cars and large transactions, 1% isn't nothing. That's a significant number. Okay? So you want to be very careful of that kind of thing. Now, additionally, more severe problems can happen if inflation goes completely out of control. Now, we mentioned that this is an overall rise in price level, so it can happen because prices naturally rise. It's also tied to the idea of the purchasing value of your money going down. Now, this isn't necessarily a currency conversion situation of the US dollar is strong or weak relative to the yen or the yuan, which that's not what we're talking about. What we're saying is that your money, literally, when you go to the store, $5 doesn't buy you a lot of stuff. Now, when this can become a problem is when your currency becomes way too common, typically because the government is overprinting it. In America, this doesn't happen very often. We have a pretty good monetary policy framework set by the Federal Reserve that tends to not print money just for no reason. They're currently printing money due to COVID, but that's to get more cash flow into the economy to then help stimulate spending to help get us out of a recession. That is an appropriate policy that might have a downside in inflation. But if your government decides to print money for another reason, say you're Germany and it's after World War I, and you've been tasked with the impossible task, frankly, of paying off all of the world's debt acquired in World War I because you are blamed for the majority of the problems of World War I. So you're asked to pay France's war debts, you're asked to pay England's war debts, you're asked to pay America's war debts, you're asked to pay Russia's war debts for World War I. You cannot afford to do that. There's no way that you can afford to do that. So what do? Do you decide to just pay that debt consistently year after year after year over the next projected to be 280 to 350 years, if you're doing it at a reasonable rate? Seeing as Germany at that point had only existed for 80 years, that's probably not the game plan. What they decide to do is they decide to print off all the money that they're going to use to pay off that debt. They literally print the bill. They're like, okay, you guys need 35 billion German marks? Cool, we're going to print you 35 billion German marks and give them to you. Great. It chipped the war debt down significantly. They ended up finishing paying off World War I's war debt, I want to say, 3 or 4 years ago. So only 100 years as opposed to 300 years. That's significantly less time to pay back World War I's full debt. But it did destroy the value of their currency. That girl in this picture is not playing with bricks. She is playing with stacks of German marks. She's playing with their currency. Because it was cheaper to just bundle up the currency with little bits of string and twine into brick form than to go to the store to buy toys. There were so many German marks in existence that the value of them dropped consistently and insanely each day. It dropped by over 1,000% in one day, meaning a loaf of bread that cost you 2 German marks in the morning cost you 2,500 German marks at 8 p.m. that day. That's not good. That's not going to work out. So what do people do? They freaked out, they panicked, they had a really, really rough time, and this all sort of set the stage for Hitler to come to power in terms of massive economic crisis, They need some kind of hero to save them from this problem. Hitler rallies them around some ideas of economic principles, of building back up Germany's military to allow them to get back some economic power, and blah, 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 World War II. Right? That's more complicated than that. But there's the sort of like, why does inflation matter? It's like, well, if your government does some dumb things, which don't underestimate the government's ability to be stupid, you can set the stage for some really dangerous stuff to happen, like Hitler. Now, this all being said, there are more than one type of inflation to talk about. What I was just describing is called hyperinflation, which is incredibly high and accelerating inflation. 1,000% value of a currency drop in a day is not a normal thing and should not really be happening. It almost always happens by overprinting your currency, typically because the government wants to spend a bunch of money without paying for it with taxes or anything, or borrowing it from anybody else. They don't want to take out a loan. They don't want to or can't tax their people. Cool, what do? They push the magic print more money button, and then their currency becomes almost worthless in an instant. Okay, it becomes very tricky. The other two types are less terrible. Demand pull is the normal one. It's what I call typical demand, or typical inflation, where inflation is caused by rising demand. That's too many consumers existing, chasing too few of goods. Say, our production ability stays the same, but we have more and more people. Think birth rate going up is a good example of that, right? If we're having more kids don't like produce goods, right? So supply isn't going to be going up there, right? There isn't like more production capability when you have more children. There is more demand though, because children do still need products to survive. They need food, they need water, they want consumer products too, and a little bit of capital products now that we have like kids requiring to have cell phones and stuff basically. Great. Prices are going to speed up because of that. Prices are going to start to go up. So it could be caused by too many consumers chasing too few goods. It could be caused, and here's the dumb thing with inflation, because you think inflation's going to happen. So let me explain that. It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think the price of a thing's going to go up next week, what do? Well, you buy it now, right? Cool, that's increasing demand, isn't it? Yeah, which is going to cause the price to go up. Yeah. So if we all hear on the news, hey, there's going to be 5% inflation next year, what might you do this year? Probably spend more, especially on your big ticket purchases, your things like a home or a car. I've been playing kind of patient on getting a car. I've had my same car for 10 years now. Since I was 16, I've had the same car. It's been fine. It's okay. It's not fancy. I've been waiting on getting a new car. If I hear that inflation is going to be 7 or 8% next year, I'm going to buy my car this year before the prices get high, right? Cool. If everybody does that, though, inflation's going to pick up even more because too much demand causes inflation. That is going to cause more demand. Okay. You could also have too low of unemployment. This is something we've been sort of expecting to happen the last couple of years prior to COVID, because we were having very, very, very low unemployment rate. Which when that happens, you have a lot more people with money who can spend it, so that's more demand. You could also have wages start to inflate, which can then cause people to spend more money and cause more inflation. Now, again, if you have wages inflating or people having jobs, that type of inflation is inherently not as bad. Like, that is acceptable in the terms of the reason why we have inflation is that so many people have jobs. That might be a worthwhile deal, especially if it's like, oh no, 3.5% inflation. Okay, but if everybody has a job and we're getting paid with there's only like a 0.2, 0.3% gap in between the inflation rate and our wage rate for that year, maybe that's okay. Cost push is inflation caused by a decrease in supply. Now this is like a large-scale supply. This is like supply of everything in our economy being hit. That could be a natural disaster. So like a massive hurricane in a port city that really messes it up bad. Okay, Hurricane Katrina possibly could have done that if it had done more damage to Houston. Did a lot of damage to New Orleans. If it had also gotten Houston as badly, that would have probably worked. But natural disasters in America, because of how big America is, tends not to crush us that bad. But other things, political actions, boycotts, tariffs, can cut the supply. The example for America there is OPEC. The oil-producing countries in the Middle East back in the 70s cut off their trade to us, and our ability to get oil from the Middle East dampened a lot. Well, okay, if oil, we can't get it, what happens to the price? It goes up quite a bit. Okay, if there's a limited supply of oil and the price is really high, what's going to happen in our country? You guys live in Texas, especially if you're watching my videos. Most of my students are in Texas. This is a place where you have to drive to do things. You go to school, you're pretty much driving to school. I have to go to work, I have to drive to work. And you go to the grocery store, I have to drive to the grocery store. I need gas to do kind of anything. So if gas gets really expensive, I can't do a lot of the things that I'm supposed to be able to do. That's going to be a massive economic burden for me. That's cost-push inflation. This is also often referred to as stagflation, because when you have this supply decrease inflation, that usually means there's less spending and prices are going up, as opposed to demand pull, which in all these cases the problem is there's more spending driving up prices. That's kind of a worth it deal, right? More spending is good, inflation is bad. So they kind of cancel each other out. Okay, depends on the scale, but those can cancel each other and be like a net positive interaction. Cost push is a negative interaction because it's less spending is going to happen because we can't afford to. We're not getting any kind of kickback that's positive, and prices are going up. So we're spending less and prices are going up. I have less money and I can't buy as many things. That sounds bad and bad, right? So cost push inflation is bad. It's more frequent for us to see cost push inflation, aka stagflation, as opposed to hyperinflation. That one is really unlikely to be seen by America. It still happens in the world today. Zimbabwe has been kind of made fun of in economic circles for the last dozen years or so because they had like a $300 trillion bill because they had such high hyperinflation that having a $100 note for them was worthless. It would be like having a coin worth 0.000001 cent. And you're like, why would I ever have that coin? I would need so many of them. It's like, right, that's why you end up printing a $300 trillion bill, so that you can actually have currency that is working. So Zimbabwe had this problem, Turkey's had this problem. I mean, countries have run into this issue because the government can have problems like this where they need to spend money because they need to provide stuff for their citizens, but they can't tax their citizens because their citizens don't have money, or because they won't let them tax them. That's an America problem, where our citizens don't let us tax, don't like taxes, or they can't get loans from people, right? Our government can borrow money from a bunch of other countries because, frankly, our government is pretty good at paying our debt. It's not that we paid it off, but we make consistent payments. We are a good person to own debt of because America has money all the time and will be paying you constantly. And it's nice to have some sort of weight over the United States, some sort of pressure on America. Politically, that's very helpful. Smaller countries, you can't trust them to pay it back all the time, so we don't always loan them the money. They could literally stop existing relatively easily. A lot of small countries their governments aren't stable enough for them to be like, yeah, we'll exist for the next 200 years, no problems. It's like, yeah, that's not necessarily the case. And they don't have the ability to make up that money very quickly. America kind of can. We have so much, I mean, you see in our GDP, we have so much in the form of assets that we can actually kind of pay it off, theoretically. Will we? Probably not. But if we owe you money for a long period of time, that's pretty helpful. It's been helpful for China. So, with all this being said, it gets even weirder when you think of the fact that actually you can benefit from inflation. If the price of everything is going up, you could actually benefit from that. And you're like, well, how does that work? Well, let's think about it. So unexpected inflation can cause people to lose or gain wealth. It's tricky because when you're not expecting it, it can actually kick back a positive for you. So we're going to try and think of, are these people going to be helped or hurt by unexpected inflation? So I'm going to show these all. I want you to sort of think about it. Like, is this person, in number one, it's the bank, and number two, it's the farmer we're talking about. Okay? This idea of a fixed interest rate and how inflation might come into play there. If your interest rate is fixed, that just means like when you're paying back a loan, if it says it's a 3% fixed interest rate, just means you're paying back 3% interest on that loan every year, no matter what. So pause the video, think, are these people going to be helped or hurt by inflation happening? Okay, so for number one, it says banks extend fixed rate, meaning that just for inflation, loans, meaning banks are giving out these loans where there's a fixed interest rate involved. Why does that matter? Okay. Why it matters is when you take out the loan for a product, for buying a home, buying a car, something like that, you then use that money to buy that product. And then you pay back that loan plus interest over time, right? You end up paying back more than what you spent. right? That's the idea of a loan, okay? But if the interest rate doesn't adjust for inflation, you might actually pay back less in value over time. Example, say you buy a car for 15 grand this year with a loan for 15 grand with like a 2 or 3% inflation rate or interest rate. That is a super low interest rate on that. But still, $15,000 car, 3% interest rate on the loan. Great. Say there is 6% inflation every single year. That car is going to be getting 6% more expensive every single year. You're paying back $15,000 plus 3% every year. Meaning, as opposed to waiting and trying to buy that car when you have enough money to buy it, by buying it early and just paying back a little bit of interest as opposed to that inflation rate, you're actually saving money. So, for the answer here, lenders, because we're talking about the bank here, the bank is giving out the loan, lenders get hurt by unexpected inflation, okay, because their interest rate isn't accounting for it in that situation, because they have a fixed rate loan. They're giving this money to you, you're going to be paying back $15,000 plus 3%. The bank actually is losing money on that deal because you're paying back less in value than what you borrowed. It's the basic idea. You're paying back less in value than what you borrowed because you don't pay back $15,000 in one go. You're paying back $15,000 and some over time, but that's becoming less and less valuable over time, the amount that you're paying back. For two, it's basically the same idea. I'm just talking about from the borrower's perspective. Is the borrower helped or hurt? Well, if the lender is hurt, then the borrower is going to be helped by that, right? So if you're borrowing, then you actually benefit from inflation, unexpected inflation, because your debt effectively is less valuable, which is good for you. Like, you'd like your debt to be not valuable at all because then it's worthless and you can basically pay it off instantly. So when you take out, like, a student loan, for example, to pay for college, and there's a lot of inflation and the price of college is getting higher and higher and higher, but you've already taken a loan out and it's covered you, you're paying back that loan. You're not paying back for the current price of college. You're just paying back for the loan amount of when you went to college, which was when it was cheaper. So borrowers benefit. Lenders get hurt by it. Savings. Your savings are in a savings account with a fixed interest rate. That's not ideal for you then, right? You're not getting as much in interest as you'd like. You put in $1,000 now, hoping that in 10 years you would have $1,000 plus interest. But what if in 10 years $1,000 has the spending power of $500 now? Then you're not saving as much as you think, right? Your brain hasn't made the calculation necessary to realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm actually not going to be getting enough out of that savings as I thought I was before. This isn't to say to not save. This is just to be careful. If you have a savings account, you're looking for an adjustable rate, a rate that will correct for inflation. That can happen, but again, unexpected inflation can mess that up because the bank will be able to correct for expected inflation, not necessarily unexpected inflation, right? That's where they can get tricked up. And then 4, retired couple lives entirely on income from a fixed rate pension plan. That's a retirement fund the woman receives from her employer. So basically this lady paid into her retirement over the course of her job, and then her retirement gets paid out to her after she retires. But here's the problem. When you're working for, 30, 40 years, and then you're going to try and live off of that retirement money for another probably 20 years, ideally. But what if you were working back in the 60s and 70s and you're retiring in like 2000, 2010? Prices are a hell of a lot different now. You might have been contributing 10% of your income back then to your retirement, but that could have been like $200 a month at best, and that does not get you very far right now. So if you got a fixed rate pension, one that did not correct for inflation, one that was just flat on what you put into it, you're getting hurt. So both 3 and 4 are different forms of savers, but in both cases, savers also get hurt by unexpected inflation. Who benefits? Borrowers. Borrowers love unexpected inflation because it makes the debt payments they're paying back less value-wise. It's a number that matters, but that number they're paying back is less in value than what they borrowed initially. That's what you have to be thinking about. But lenders and savers are both hurt by unexpected inflation. Lenders because they're getting less back, they're getting paid back less in value. savers because they're saving less in value. That's a problem. Now, when we talked about GDP, we mentioned the idea of nominal and real. I'm going to mention that one more time. Whenever you hear a nominal number, that is a number using that year's prices. That is a not correcting for inflation number. When you see the term real, that means that number is corrected to reflect a base year's prices. Meaning, if you see like real GDP of 2009 and real GDP of 2000, and they're talking in like the same sentence, then those two GDPs are made using the same prices. So they're very easy to compare. It would tell you if real GDP in 2009 is bigger than real GDP in 2000 that you actually produced more in 2009 than you did in 2000. Because your prices were sort of taken out as a variable. Real is adjusting for inflation by holding prices constant. Why that matters? Because I don't think I really got into a good job of it on my last video. So here is median household income in the United States. This is nominal. If they don't tell you if it's real, it's nominal. So like when you see median household income, you're like, how do you know that's nominal or real? Because they didn't tell me. If they're leaving that like part of it blank, it's the nominal number. So this is just median income in the U.S. 1986. This is probably 1984, reasonably, based on the chart. Means that's below 25K. It's like 24K back in 1984. 2018 median income, so this is prior to the current economic situation, was right around 64K. That is an awesome increase. That is a $40,000 jump over the course of 34 years? 34 years. It's a lot, right? It's a huge jump. And really only like once, which is during the recession, like the capitalized recession. And this is also a recession, this was also a recession, but that's the big one that happened as the housing market crashed back in 2008. Was the only time where our median income actually dipped down, and it might have only dipped down by like 1K. So if you're looking at this chart, you're like, okay, cool, our incomes have gone up. Got it, Mr. McRitchie. No, der. Also, awesome, America's amazing right now. Okay, guys. Here's the problem with that. Prices are a lot different now than they were back in the 80s, right? Does this account for that? No. It doesn't account for the fact that prices have changed. So let's look at it if the prices have changed. Let's take the real income in the United States. That chart tells me a very different story. It tells me that we haven't seen consistent growth. It's been a lot more sporadic. We are still doing a heck of a lot better now than we were back in 84. But look at this. This is using 2018's CPI, which is just a way of saying we're using 2018's prices here. Using 2018's prices, we were roughly at 63K in median income. Using 2018's prices back in 1984, we were at roughly 52K. There isn't a $40,000 difference in our income since the 80s. It's right about 10K. That's still an increase, and quite a bit of one. But not nearly as significant a one as you might have previously thought. Also, there are a lot bigger dips on this graph. Okay, there are a lot larger drops. And they actually have more than just once. You have, in each recession, there's a drop. And in each of the cases of the recession, there was a bit of a drop beforehand. And that's usually because for it to be labeled a recession, it needs to be over a certain length of time. So this first indicator is like, oop, things are going bad. And then official time benchmark hits. Now we are in a recession. So dips down, officially a recession, starts to curve back up. Dips down, officially a recession, starts to flatten back out. Drops off the face of a cliff, in this case, because it's the recession. And in code, it's probably going to be a little worse looking than that. Drops down, smooths out a little bit. Drops down again, though, because that was a really bad one. Smooths out finally. Goes up, drops back down for a second. That one happened because Obama raised taxes. That's normal, because when you raise taxes, that will reduce incomes. The net income for people will drop when you raise taxes. So he did right there. So that explains that one. Not an economic crisis, just like raise taxes, cool, dip. Raise taxes, I think, was also the case. Actually, that one didn't show up. That's actually impressive. Because Clinton raised taxes too, but it didn't show up at all. Our economy was doing much better under Clinton. Not saying Clinton's a great president, but economy did really well underneath him. Okay, and then we're back up to normal. Again, COVID's going to crush that a bit. But also been trending upwards since 2014. flattens out a little bit, but it was kind of unsustainable growth there. This just tells me, yeah, you want to look at real numbers. If you're ever looking at a timeline and you're not using real numbers, you might be confused thinking like, hey, America is doing amazing compared to the 80s. And you're like, oh, I mean, we're doing better, yes, but the scale is a lot smaller. It's a lot less of a gap than we thought. And it hasn't been as smooth of a road. Now, how do we track for inflation? I already mentioned the idea of inflation rate, which does exist. And I'll tell you how we find it. But inflation rate just gives us a numerical like, hey, 2% is how much prices have gone up by. But how the heck do we get that? Do we take the price of literally every single good and then just sort of see the average and hope? Kind of. We kind of do that. We use what's called the Consumer Price Index or the GDP deflator. GDP deflator was mentioned in the GDP video and works very similarly to this, and I'll explain the difference in a second. But the Consumer Price Index, which is, I'm just going to call it CPI from here on out, takes a market basket, not a literal basket, but a bunch of different goods from different categories. I want to say it's like over 8,000 different goods. It's not every good in our economy, but it's basically at least one good from every sort of category you can think of. And then they track that good specifically's price year to year to year to year, and then weigh the average changes of those prices. And this will include categories like transportation, recreation, apparel, housing, medical care, blah, 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 blah. Some things to know when you see CPI. I'm going to use my little pen here so that it'll make a little more sense to you. CPI is like real GDP in that there is a base year component. There will always be like, what's the CPI of 2020 using 2014 as a base year? That means we are comparing using the prices of 2014 to 2018. That's sort of like the comparison window. If I say I'm taking the CPI of 2020 with 1986 as the base year, that's going to change things up because I'm comparing a much larger period of time. So there's going to be a much larger scale of difference in those numbers. So here's what I mean. The CPI of your base year will always be 100 because you're comparing the prices there to itself. Like I say, what's the CPI of 2014 using 2014 as the base year? Okay, so for CPI's calculation, which we'll show you how to do in a bit, I'm taking their prices, I'm using their prices, I'm measuring it against itself. Okay, it's a one-to-one thing. That means my CPI is going to be 100. If I were to find the CPI in 2020 compared to 2014, my CPI in 2020 is like 116. All that means is that between that period of time, 2014 to 2020, that there was a 16% increase in prices. That's where we get inflation rate from. Inflation rate doesn't involve taking the price of everything. It involves grabbing either the CPI, or you could also do this with GDP deflator. Grab one of those two numbers, and then you do a quick little rate of change, which is that whole a formula you should be familiar with in school at this point. Year 2 minus year 1 over year 1. Let me clear some stuff out of the way. Erase all that. Times 100. That will get you the inflation rate. You plug in the CPI of each year, and then you times it by 100. So that's how you end up getting CPI. It's also how, this is how you end up getting inflation rate. This is the inflation rate formula up here. So when I saw 116 and 110, what I did was 116 minus 100 over 100 times 100 cancels. 116 minus 100 is 16. There's a 16% increase in prices. That's what CPI tells you. It's a number that lets us get the inflation rate. So like if I'm ever looking and I just see like, okay, who would it be? The BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, reports that the CPI for 2020 is going to be 106 compared to the CPI of 2018. What that tells me is over the last 2 years, we've had 6% inflation. Right, so we've gone up 6% from 2018 to 2020. Now here is what I refer to as the super terrifying chart that gives all my students a bunch of nightmares. Make my head super tiny on this. Make sure that I have my notes tab open because I want to make sure that I have my math part right and I'm not going to mess it up. Alright, there it is. So what we've got here are numbers from 1987 and from 2019. what we're going to do is we're going to use inflation rate. We're going to try and see, okay, how much did prices change by from 1987 until 2019? That is a period of time of 32 years. It's a long time, right? 32 years is a decently long amount of time. We're going to find that rate of change, and we're going to project it forward, finding the rate of change, the inflation rate, and then using that inflation rate to try and see, okay, we know how expensive things are now. Let's try and peek into the future a little bit and see, using the same rate of change as what's happened in the last 32 years, what'll happen 32 years from now in 2051. The reason why I picked these years and this like space of time is that reasonably this would be around, on average, the time period where my students would be the same age as their parents are now. My students were born in 2003 right now. So if they average having their kids in their late 20s, early 30s, in that sort of window of time, then in 2051 they will be roughly their parents' age, which would be mid to late 40s for most of my students. Okay, if their parents are older than that or younger than that, bummer. Law of averages, guys. So I'm trying to see how expensive things are going to be when you are your parents' age, right? You judge them all the time, you make fun of them all the time for what they buy, what they don't buy, and stuff like that. Cool, let's see what you'll be dealing with price-wise and what they dealt with price-wise. So how we do this, we're going to try and find rate of change. Okay, well, rate of change formula is the one that I showed on the previous slide. Year 2 minus year 1. Yeah, this pen is super great. Over year 1 will get me the rate of change. And then when I times it by 100, that'll get me the inflation rate. So what I need to do is I'm just going to take 250. I'm going to do this on like my phone calculator to not have my screen get any busier than it's already going to be, because I'm writing in these numbers. I don't have a slide with all the answers on it. 250 minus 113 over 113 means my rate of change is, let me erase this now, 1.22. For my inflation rate, I just times that by 100. Gets me under 22%. And then what I need to do is I need to find what it's going to be like in 2051. So what I do is I take that rate, the rate of change here, times this number, my 2019-2020 number, and then I add this number in. Same way I did like this year 2 minus year 1 thing over year 1. Cool, I'm going to try and solve for year 2 is the idea. So what I need to do is, and here's the formula, I'm going to use the same formula for the rest of it. It is to find this, which I'm just going to label as x. X equals my rate times the 1920 number, which I'm going to call y, plus y. That's how I'm finding what goes into this column. So if you ever want to come back to it, that's what I'm doing. What you should be doing here is, a good thing to do is to pause this video and try and test yourself. Can I figure out the inflation rate, and can I figure out what the numbers are going to be in the future? Okay, pause this video, start working through it, and maybe have the panic attack that my students do, which is they start to freak out seeing what things are going to be like when they're an adult. For the 2050-2051 CPI, which is not a scary number because you probably don't really understand it yet, I'm just taking the 1.22. I'm just going to stick with that simplified version of it. If you want to make it fancier, you can. Times 251 plus 251. And it gets me a CPI of some hilariously high number, which is 557.22. I'm just going to write it 557. Let me explain that CPI bit and sort of like what those numbers mean. This is using 1984 as a base year for the CPI of 113. It just means from 1984 to 1987 that there's 13% inflation. That's what CPI tells me. That's how CPI works. which isn't alarming because that means okay, over 4 years we had 13% inflation. That means we're averaging about 3% inflation per year. That is right on track with what our government normally averages and is expecting. That's kind of fine. It means from 1984 till 2019 that prices went up by 151%. Granted, that is a time period of about 35 years. So that means we're averaging a little more than 4% inflation per year over that stretch. Not insane, not terrible, not ideal, but not the end of the world, right? Over the course of 35 years, having 151% inflation is a lot, but averages out to be a more reasonable number each year. Again, this is with 1984 as the base year. Now, the 2051-52 number means that from 1984 to 2051, okay, we're talking a period of almost 80 years. It's a long, long time. Almost 80 years. Okay? For context here, I will be almost 70 years old in 2051. I'm 26 right now. So it's a period of 80 years. We will have experienced 457% inflation. A lot. Yeah. It's a little more than 5% per year is the average there. That's kind of high. That's high. It's not insane. A lot of countries have had worse than that. It's not unreasonable. It's just high. Okay, so let's look through it for the remainder. I'm going to skip the rates of change and just try and get to the final answers here. So give me a second to make sure that I do this part right. But it should be 62,000 minus 22,500 divided by 22,500. Okay, my rate of change there is 1.75, repeating. I'm going to multiply that by 62,000. I'm going to add 62,000 to that. Which means that my median income should be right around $171,000. If we get slightly different numbers, it's probably just a rounding. Don't freak out. That's mostly fine. That sounds awesome. That seems like a super sick average income for us to be having in 2051. 171K a year is like the normal income amount. Like this is slightly above what I get paid as a teacher. Teachers are typically at or a teeny bit to a decent amount below average income, which means I'd probably be like right in the 160, 155K a year range in that year. That sounds dope. But let's see if it keeps up with everything else, because that's where I'd be worried. Is like, that sounds great, but everything being 457% more expensive than the 80s scares me with that number. The minimum wage, which, to be clear, the minimum wage does not adjust for inflation. There is no rule saying they have to change it for inflation. In some cases, it's been $7.25 an hour since the 90s. So that's not amazing for us. Let's do it really quick to see what would happen if it did. 725 minus 3.35 divided by 3.35. Okay, that's 1.1% rate of 1.11 rate of change. That's not amazing. Multiply 7.25 by that. And then add 7.25 to that. Okay. Means that the average minimum wage would be roughly $15.33 an hour. That sounds good. Again, let's see how expensive other stuff costs before we get into the idea of that is a good deal. But if we found out that effectively your kids, because if we're talking my students, this is roughly when when their kids would be their age. So like their kids are like seniors in high school, they could be making $15 an hour at a part-time job as the minimum wage. It's the worst they could do. Sounds pretty good. Let's see how the fast food burger price goes. Okay. And this is like single burger. This is not even a quarter pounder. This is like literally the cheapest burger on the menu, average fast food burger. So we do 1.77 minus 0.77. Okay, divided by 0.77. All right, rate of change there is roughly 1.3. that one should be $4.10 roughly. No, sorry, I have like 4.068, so $4.07 is your, to be clear, that's like you walk to the fast food restaurant and it's like the value menu single cheeseburger is $4. Compare that in your head to this. This is catching up, right? The 4.07 is getting closer. That's a higher percentage of that than this is of that. That rate of change for the average fast food burger was roughly 1.3. This one's like 1.11. Let me grab that. I want to double check and grab that median income rate of change, because the rate of change is how you tell. Minus 22.5 over 22.5. 1.76 roughly. The rate of change is how you're going to tell if this is going to feel more or less expensive. That's like the key indicator of, is this going to feel more or less expensive for you? Okay. Now what I recommend from this point is sort of like pause the video, skip ahead a little bit to see when I finish this part, because I'm going to work through it and I can't pause the video on my end. Actually, I could just end the video here and start up with the remainder of this. Actually, yeah, I might just do that. I'm going to end this video at this point. I'm going to start the next video with the remainder of these numbers, and I'm going to get into CPI, the math of it, what that number means, what's in the market basket. So if you're looking for what is CPI, the next video will cover CPI in complete detail, and it will finish up this chart and finish up the panic attack that you're going to get. Cool. See you guys then.